Mar- Okay, so in this episode, we're going to talk specifically about the Brooklyn neighborhood of Williamsburg in the 2010s. It was really the first part of Brooklyn that I was visiting in the 2010s, and it's also really worth mentioning because it was, for most intents and purposes, the a lot of where Brooklyn's fame was derived from in that decade. Okay, so Williamsburg in itself is just a really interesting place. I believe that at one point it was its own city before it became part of Brooklyn. In any case, as I mentioned in the first episode, by the 70s and 80s, it had fallen on hard times based on what pretty much anyone who was there at that time had told me. It was, from what I heard, again, this is from older people in the neighborhood, was very segregated between a primarily Hispanic area, which was roughly between South, I guess, South Second Street and down all the way through Greenpoint. Um, I can't remember exactly what those streets are. North 12th, 10th Street, around there or so, down Bedford Avenue. And then there was a primarily Hasidic Jewish part, which was around Lee Avenue, um, also down South 10th, South 11th Street, Division Avenue, Rodney Street. There was a really big synagogue for them, another really big synagogue on Bedford, still there to this day. And then lastly, there was Italian Williamsburg, centered around Graham Avenue. Really good restaurants, Italian restaurants around there. Some of them are still there to this day. Italian stores were still there. We're talking about Graham, Leonard Street. There's a famous restaurant, Bamonte's, there. So, what did I encounter when I started going there around 2010? A lot of the old neighborhood was fading away, I guess you could say at that point. Well, I don't know. A lot of it was still there, but there was really a large transformation that was underway at that time. It was kind of like, I guess you could say, the old and the new was still there, and to some extent even today still is. Okay, especially if we're talking about Hasidic Williamsburg. You're talking about one of the most conservative religious communities in the United States. You have the Satmar group, and these people, most of them, I believe, were born in the United States. They do not speak English as a first language. They have their own language called Yiddish, and you will see signs, and you will hear people, even young children, speaking this language to each other. They're an extremely religious group, and you can see them walking around. They wear very distinctive clothing. The women wear long skirts. I believe the married women wore wigs, and the men wore black suits with wide brimmed hats. They had different headgear that they would wear, but they always had something. You can clearly know when you're in their part of town. It's very obvious. There are some parts of Williamsburg where the Hispanic and Hasidic communities overlapped, and this would be, one place was the Taylor White Houses, which is near the Brooklyn Queens Expressway. It's a large housing development, and you can actually see, you'll go around, you'll hear Hispanic families, people speaking Spanish, and right next to them are people speaking Yiddish, and they're living in the same buildings. And when I delivered pizza, I would see this going on. They don't seem to really interact, the communities, but they are living in the same area. So yeah, that's a extremely interesting place. Lee Avenue is kind of like their commercial hub, and there you will see a lot of their own groceries and bakeries, things like that, where their community lives by its own ways. And sometimes you can see their religious festivals, things of that nature. Really, really fascinating place. But that place probably has remained largely the same for many years because it is a very conservative community and just doesn't seem to change. Like I said, they don't even speak English as their first language, although they seem to be American. They all speak English, though, just to mention that. So that was a really amazing thing to encounter. One thing I remember is walking on the Williamsburg Bridge, which, as I mentioned before, Williamsburg is right next to Manhattan. It's through the Williamsburg Bridge. And it was funny, you could see the Hasidic Jewish women walking on the bridge, and they're still wearing they're on there for exercise, and they're still wearing their long skirts and kind of jogging. And the only thing that's different is that they're wearing sneakers. So that was something I remember from seeing that community. And from working there, I encountered them, had some interactions with these people, got to know them a little bit, worked in their homes as a contractor. So that was it's something to see, definitely, if you're there. So moving south from there, we have what was traditionally the Hispanic section of Williamsburg, and I believe it had been primarily Hispanic for maybe 30, 40 years, going back to the 70s or so. And this is around, like I said, South First, North First, North 2nd Street, especially South First, South 2nd seemed to be still where it was primarily Hispanic. And I believe out of the Hispanic groups, primarily Puerto Rican. So there's still a really strong Puerto Rican influence there. There's families that have lived there for a while. You'll still hear Puerto Rican music, and there's some stores catering to that community there. The bodegas, there's still a strong presence of that. And this kind of meets up with the Puerto Rican community in Bushwick, where it's probably a little stronger still to this day. So I also met these people, but yeah, in the 2010s, I think there was a lot of talk at that time about gentrification and how this community was possibly in danger because of the transformation of other people that were primarily called transplants into their part of Williamsburg. Okay, so when you heard of Williamsburg in the news, in the media, of artists and writers and just new people who were often primarily white, who were moving into Williamsburg and transforming it into this kind of center of culture. It was mostly in this part of Williamsburg, around Bedford Avenue and those streets I mentioned before. So you started to see a lot of transformation in the 2010s to businesses catering to the so-called transplants. And this at first was more like music venues and bars, nightclubs, and it continued with other things as the community grew a little older, like supermarkets. That there was a big deal was the first Starbucks, and that was on Union Avenue. And then there was the big Whole Foods that opened up on, I believe, yeah, it was Bedford Avenue. Um, Early on, there were concerts in McCarran Park, which is a large park located in Williamsburg, in that area. Later on, the McCarran pool opened up, well, reopened, a large city pool, and this was really where it was at in that decade. It's just really an incredible place. There was huge development of, especially towards the end of the decade, a lot of large buildings, apartment buildings went up right on the waterfront there, and it just really changed rapidly. It was the place to be. Um, the artists really transformed it. Probably that happened mostly in the first decade of the 2000s. And by the 2010s, it had just become a place where a lot of people wanted to live. A lot of people were moving from all over the country, all over the world, to be there. Even became more high end. It became more what a lot of people were calling gentrified. Much more wealthy people, businessmen were moving there, professionals of various kinds. And they really started to become more a place where only those more high end, high income people could afford to live also. So I saw that happen there. Although working as a contractor, especially around South First, South Second, South Third, Fourth Streets, there were still plenty of the Puerto Rican people who had been living there for a couple of generations. So I'm not sure how they were able to stay there, because it just became a very unaffordable place for people who were not very high income. And I know that this was not a high income community primarily, but somehow it still retained a lot of the Puerto Rican character that it had before. And this was kind of intermingling with the new generation of younger, whiter people who moved in the 2000s and the 2010s. So that was a real exciting place in that time. Especially early on, it was a place you could go and see all these, music, bands playing, shows. There were kind of like quirky little businesses that sprang up, little bookstores. I can't remember. There was one, I believe, on Bedford. Can't remember the name, but little bookstores. People, there was a very entrepreneurial spirit to a lot of the new generation of people that were moving in. They were opening up bars, restaurants, music venues, just really a lot from the ground up, all around, especially Bedford Avenue. It was really amazing. It started to become a place where people would go at night to go drink, to dance, party. It became a destination that part of Brooklyn had not really had. Like, you had people would possibly used to just go to Manhattan for that kind of nightlife, and then they were going to Williamsburg. But now that section towards the end of the decade, just it was really transformed into a much more high-end place. A lot of also, you had a lot of people from Manhattan. Anecdotally, I heard, were moving to Williamsburg because they were priced out of Manhattan. So that also made it more high income in terms of the people who were living there, and the businesses that the businesses more and more were catering to those people. Okay, so that was really the center of it. So I'm also going to talk about Italian Williamsburg, that, like I said, is centered around Graham Avenue, and that also I lived very close to there when I first actually moved to Brooklyn in 2012, and this was also its own place. From what I heard back in the 1980s, that the Hispanic and Italian part of Williamsburg was very segregated. That just people did not, I don't know, this did not cross from one part to the other. It seemed like it was kind of tense. Um, Graham Avenue was known for heavy mafia presence up through maybe the early 2000s, when I heard that they moved out. Not sure how much was still there in the 2010s, but especially around Graham Avenue, you had great Italian restaurants. My favorite was Carmine's, um, and that was located at around Graham and Metropolitan, and it's still there. Highly recommended. Great restaurant. Um, there was Bamonte's, which I believe was on Withers Street. Which from what I know, is possibly over 100 years old. It's a really, really famous place. There were also Italian pork stores along Graham Avenue. There's Graham Avenue Meats, which I used to go in sometimes and get eggplant parmesan, which was they just have it right there for you. Um, so this place, I would say, along the 2010s, it mostly lost its Italian character and was replaced by more the same type of people who moved into the Hispanic part of Williamsburg. It also started to originally cater more towards the artsier crowd in the 2000s, the early 2010s, and then towards the end of the decade, more to a more professional crowd, you could say, that was moving in. Still kind of had a artsy entrepreneurial spirit to it. It was its own kind of interesting place. Similar types of businesses, new restaurants opened up, clothing stores, hair salons. A lot of that catered to the new people moving in. Vegan restaurants. This was really, if you were or are a vegetarian or a vegan, this part was really a place to go. Same with the other part of Williamsburg I mentioned around Bedford Avenue. Really catered to a lot of people who were vegetarian or vegan. There was Vinny's Pizzeria, which served up vegan pizza. Plenty of other places too that were and still are catering to people who have that kind of diet. Let's see, there was also there was Champs. Where was that? That was in that part of Williamsburg for a while. I can't remember what street, but around Graham Avenue. And yeah, the Graham Avenue really transformed. I remember there was a guy who always used to, when I would take the L train back from work, would be standing outside. It was a place that said it sold headstones. Like, it was a place you could go in, and if for after a funeral needed a gravestone, and that's what they did, and but the owner, the guy who worked there, would be outside every, I think it was every afternoon, and he'd be selling bread, like leftover bread from a bakery. I think he told me once his cousin owned a bakery nearby, and he'd just be standing outside like selling bread from there. Um, just kind of a random memory. Um, but yeah, this was a great place. You had all the things that made Brooklyn famous at that time. You know, people on bicycles. You know, starting art galleries, starting their own photography shows, and starting new restaurants, new chefs moving in. It had that real entrepreneurial spirit, and just there was old buildings being knocked down, new buildings being put up. What else? Oh yeah, Crest Hardware. How can I forget? So Crest Hardware is on Metropolitan Avenue, and this was like the owner, I guess, really took an interest in, you know, he was kind of an artsy guy himself, I guess you could say, and he took an interest in things like that. And I think they used to have like their own music show every year. And he had a pig in the hardware store. Like it had its own little pig pen in the garden section. The pig's name was Franklin, and he had these. He'd sell like little magnets of Franklin you could buy there, and it was a really quirky place. Um, and right next down from there was the Kellogg's Diner, still there, I believe, which is kind of like the main diner in Williamsburg, at least definitely in that part. And see what else. There's Buffalo Exchange, which you had also. This was kind of like a, you know, the prime era for thrift stores. So you had Buffalo Exchange, you had Junk in Williamsburg, and these were just places you could go in and just, you know, buy old clothes and knickknacks, and that was a real trend at that time doing that. Like you know, you had people in punk rock and things like that who were into that kind of stuff. So it was definitely a destination for that. And later on, these places, you know, seemed like they became famous for those reasons. So some music venues. There was Music Hall of Williamsburg. I remember I saw the first time I wanted to hear what there was all this talk about dubstep music at that time, and I went to a show there and heard it for the first time. Wasn't really impressed. Um, uh, there were there were the other like kind of semi legal places. I can't remember what they were, but I remember hearing that, you know, so and so was the last one to close down, and this was towards the end of the decade. Really, that's a lot of what you were hearing about was how the artistic entrepreneurial spirit of Williamsburg was kind of already in decline by probably 2015, maybe even earlier, and really continued towards the end of the decade where it was geared more towards professionals. But in any case, all these communities that I mentioned before um, still had a presence in Williamsburg. It all kind of um, coexisted, if not, and it didn't really intermingle. The communities kind of lived separately, but they coexisted in this one place. So it's probably a lot more I could say about Williamsburg. Leave it in the comments if you want me to talk about something, because really I was there through this whole decade and there's so much to say. There's so many amazing things that happened and so much transformation. Let me know if you want me to talk about it, or if you have any questions. Pretty much any of them I can answer for you. Okay, so that's it for Williamsburg for this time. I might think of another episode to speak about it or some part of Williamsburg during that decade. Again, hit the like button if you enjoyed this and leave a comment if you have a question or something to say.